Zokvik. I'm the instructional designer here in the Faculty Success Center. Before I was here, I worked at Spring Arbor University as an assistant instructional designer. And there I spent a lot of time working on accessibility and helping faculty to make accessible documents, including syllabi. So one of my big focuses here at KVCC is doing that accessibility work and sort of coming alongside faculty to help them design accessible and equitable learning experiences. And not just in virtual environments, but also in face-to-face as well. Obviously, today we're focusing more on sort of the digital side of that, but you can implement some of these strategies in other materials you're creating as well. In a lot of ways, this is a continuation of a workshop I did earlier that is accommodation, accessibility, and access, that talks about sort of the differences between those things and why we might use accommodations in some situations, do accessible design in others, and sort of how broadly that all fits into access. That's kind of a high-level overview. That workshop is also on the Faculty Success Center YouTube channel if you want to check that out, so you can take a look at that later if you want. But with that, let's go ahead and get going. So the first thing I think it's important to do is to clarify our terms. When we're talking about accessibility, what does that really mean? And in its most basic form, it's really working with and working to make content and context available to all people, regardless of their ability or any physical or cognitive barriers they might face. And when I say accessibility specifically, we're usually talking primarily on helping learners or people who have specific disabilities or barriers in their learning, and removing those barriers by creating content that they can access. Most disabilities fall into sort of 4 primary categories, each of which have their own disabilities and design strategies that we use for mitigating them. So that graphic on the left-hand side of the screen there is just a quick sum up of what those categories are. Motor disabilities could be people who use a wheelchair for mobility. Maybe they have a broken arm, or maybe they lack fine motor control and so have difficulty using a mouse. Cognitive barriers, these run the gamut from things like ADHD, dyslexia, all the way to situations like anxiety and depressive disorders. And it's worth pointing out here that oftentimes these were called cognitive disabilities or cognitive barriers in the past. The term that is more used now is the term neurodiversity. And just sort of understanding and accepting that we all think and process and understand the world in very different ways. Auditory, this one's pretty self-explanatory. Involves people that usually have either complete or partial hearing loss. And then visual, and this is probably the biggest category that we're going to focus on today, because the web and digital spaces are, in many ways, a very digitally focused, a very visually focused medium. And this includes not only things like complete blindness, but also things like low vision or color blindness as well. And so there are several barriers that are in the technology we use that a person might have to deal with. Using a mouse might be a barrier that someone faces. Using a keyboard can be difficult. Differentiating different items based on color. Images and video, particularly if video can be challenging not only in the visual sense, but also in the auditory sense. Distracting or flashing animations that can't be turned off. Needlessly complicated layouts. If there's just too much information on the screen at one time, it can be very difficult to process. And then complex diagrams and charts. So with what accessibility is out of the way, now that we've got our terms straight, why is it important? Why do we spend all this time doing it? And why in particular do we do accessibility work up front rather than just sort of waiting for someone to request it? There are a few different reasons. First, roughly 11% of learners in higher education have some sort of disability that interferes with their ability to learn. And that kind of on its own would be reason enough to do that work, to do this accessibility work. But it becomes even more important and urgent when you couple that with another number, and that is of those 11%, between 60 and 80% don't request a specific learning accommodation or an accommodation that they might need to help with their learning needs. And they might not request that for a variety of reasons, right? Maybe they don't want to appear to be a burden to their classmates or to their professor. Maybe they don't want to disclose their disability for a variety of reasons. Or maybe they just don't know that help or resources are available to them, and so they don't know how to go about requesting them. And those are all perfectly valid and natural. So there's that large percentage of the population that has a disability that they could get help for, but they aren't reporting it. And so they rely on someone having done this accessibility work in their course ahead of time. The second reason why we do it is that accessibility is necessary for some, but helpful for all. So let's say you decide you want to add captions to your videos. That's a very common, very useful accessibility step that you would take if you wanted to make your course more accessible. And those captions are necessary for a learner who is hard of hearing. Without hearing, they can't process the audio content that's in the videos. If those captions don't exist, they have no way of understanding why that video is important. But those captions can also be helpful for anyone. Imagine you're just trying to sit in a coffee shop listening to a video and it's noisy around. You can turn on those captions. You can make it a little bit easier to understand the complex content. You can follow along with the captions as you're hearing the video. And there's some research that says about 95% of people who watch video have used captions at some point and find them helpful. So they're not always necessary, but they can be helpful for everyone. And then the last reason we do it is what I have on the screen here, and this is called the ability continuum. And oftentimes when we think about accessibility or we think about disability, we often sort of think of it as this binary state. We think of either a person is disabled or they're able. When in reality, it's much different than that. It's not just a person is blind or not. It's not just a person uses a wheelchair or does not, or a person is deaf or not. We all sort of exist on this continuum from completely able to not at all able. And we move along this continuum throughout life, right? The common example is as you get older, your vision will go bad and you move more towards the left end, more towards the not able side of this continuum. But it's not all movement in one direction. It's not all sort of slow, steady movement either. I could get done doing this workshop, go outside for a walk and fall and break my arm. At that point, I now have a temporary motor disability and I move more towards the not able portion of the spectrum. Now in time, my arm will heal, hopefully, and I'll move back more towards the right side. But one of the reasons we do the accessibility work is to sort of hedge against these sort of unpredictable events, right? Because anybody could become some amount of disabled at any point. And so rather than having to always react in the spur of the moment to that, if we've done the accessibility work up front, it's much easier to create learning environments and contexts that will be accessible for everyone. So with that, now that we've talked about the what and the why, how do we actually do some of this stuff in Office? Like I said, we're going to talk mainly about visual accessibility and things that people with visual barriers have the most difficulty with. But there are some other workshops on the Faculty Success Center dealing with individuals who have auditory challenges, designing for individuals with neurodiversity. Molly has a whole great workshop on how to make sure your video content gets captioned. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, highly recommend checking all those out as well. But today we're going to focus on sort of 5 major areas. We're going to talk about making sure your document is structured properly, so it's navigable by learners using assistive technologies like screen readers. We're going to talk about how to add alt text to your images so they can be seen by a learner with a screen reader. And we'll talk about how to appropriately choose contrasting colors and design for color blindness. We'll talk about ways to format data and other information easy to parse ways so that ways that you can make tables accessible. And then we'll talk about creating descriptive links so an individual can understand and know where they're going. So first is the structure. how do people move about and how do they find the information they need in the document? And the first thing we want to talk about here is heading styles and heading levels. And these are fairly easy to do in Microsoft Word. And document headings are one of those things that help us navigate and understand the structure of a document. When they're used well, they can in many ways function like a table of contents that helps a person sort of scan quickly through a document and find the information you're looking for. For example, if a learner was going through the syllabus, they might be able to scan quickly and scan the headings for things like weekly objectives or a grade schedule or course policies in the syllabus. Get something in the chat here. Oh, Molly's just linking those playlists. Fantastic. Thank you. So we want to make sure when we're creating headings to organize them properly. There's a few rules we have to be aware of when we're doing that. First, you want to make sure you're always nesting your headings properly. And you can sort of see by the example over here on the right, you want to make sure your heading 2s are underneath your heading 1s, your heading 3s are underneath your 2s, so on and so forth. Heading 1 is always going to be your document title. You're only ever going to really have a single heading 1 in your document. And then you just want to make sure you go in order. Like you wouldn't want to put a heading 4 underneath a heading 2. And you don't want to skip levels either. So you want to make sure you're going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. So with that, let's go ahead and I'll swap over to my document here and I'll show you how to actually do this in Microsoft Word. So here we've got the sort of sample document that I sent you. And doing heading styles is actually very, very simple in Microsoft Word. You'll see up here on the Home tab of the ribbon, there's this whole area of heading styles. I'm on a Mac. This might look slightly different if you're using Microsoft Office on Windows, but you should be able to find all of these things in pretty much the exact same place. So to create a heading style for a piece of text, all you have to do is highlight the text you want and then go up here to this list of styles and select the one you want. So if I want to make this a heading 1, all I do is click heading 1 and I'm done. Now, obviously that changed the sort of the size and weight of the typeface that I had in there. So maybe I don't want it to be that large. Maybe I want my heading 1 to look differently. So I can still update these styles. I can highlight this and shrink the font size back down to say 20, and I can center it. And then if I want this to still be a heading 1, all I have to do is right click on this heading here, and I can update heading 1 to match selection. That will say for any heading 1s in this document, they will then apply this new centered formatting with the font size that I have chosen. So if I do that, there we go, and it's now updated. And if I select this, you can see that it's heading 1. Now, if we go through the rest of this document, you'll see several other headings like this: instructor contact and course information, prerequisites, textbook, purpose of the course, etc. And you'll see that if I highlight all these, they are showing up and they're defined as normal text. Because when this document was made, all that happened was the font size changed and it was made bold. They weren't defined as a heading style. So if I do this and I then make this a heading 2, and again, that changed the font styling. So if I just go here and I'll change it to 14, do Calibri, and then all I have to do is go, and then I want to update heading 2 to match selection, and then I can go through and just select all these and make them heading 2, and we're good to go. So, and you can see an overview of your headings in Microsoft Word if you go to this View tab of the ribbon right here, and you turn on the navigation pane. This will pop up on the left-hand side. And then this second option right here, these 3 little dots, this will give you an overview of all your headings in the document. So the first level is the FSC 101, Designing an Accessible Syllabus. And then if I click through here, this will take me to each heading that I have created in the document. So in many ways, this will be, creating heading style sort of creates a default table of contents that you can use in your document. And it will call out to someone relying on a screen reader that it will say, okay, this is heading 1, this is heading 2, so on and so forth. And they will be able to scan through the document via headings. And so it'll be much more easy for them to navigate the final document. Any questions on how headings work? All right. A couple other formatting things. For long documents, include a table of contents. And again, this is pretty easy. This won't be a very good table of contents for this document because I haven't defined all of the headings. But if I just wanted to go to the references tab, here is where you'll find the table of contents feature. And you just left click right here on table of contents, and you can pick a style that works for you. And it will insert a table of contents wherever your cursor is. So I'd want to put it here at the front. I insert a table of contents, and there it is. And it will pick up the items that you have defined as headings and create a hierarchical table of contents from those headings. So if I had heading 3s underneath here, it would include separate lines for those, and you could define. I don't want to get into specifically how to do all of the table of contents stuff, but you can define, okay, I only want it to show headings 1 and 2 on the table of contents and things like that. So that's an easy way to do that. For a short document like this, it's probably not necessary. But for longer page documents, usually like anything 10 or more pages, if you have subsections and things in it, including a table of contents can be a very, very useful accessibility feature. Bulleted and numbered lists. If we go back to the document here, you can see we have several lists. We have lists of learning outcomes, lists of assessments, and then when we get into the instructions for the quizzes, there's some bullets here. And you want to specifically define these as lists within Microsoft Word, because the way this is structured right now, it's a screen reader is just going to sort of continually read this all as one big line of text. It's not going to understand that they are discrete and defined items within a list. And again, this is pretty easy to do. All I have to do is highlight the text or the list of items that I want to make a list. Go back to the home tab of the ribbon here. And you've got 2 little buttons here. You've got the one on the left that is bullets, and this one here is numbered. In this case, it's a numbered list. So we just click on numbers, and boom, it's now a numbered list. And you can see how it sort of lined everything up here and made it, and increased the indent a little bit. And we can do the same thing here. Now you want to be careful. There's a few times when you want to use numbered lists over bulleted lists. Generally speaking, if you're listing steps in an order, numbered lists are a good thing to use. Or if you have to ever refer to a specific item in the list, like if you have instructions that say, after you've completed number 5 above, do this. You want to make sure that the number 5 in your list is clearly defined. But for the most part, anything other than that, like if you're doing anything other than clearly defined steps, or you have to reference items in the list specifically, it's recommended that you just use a bulleted list, which is again this one here, and it just looks like bullets. Now, the other thing to be careful of with lists is you want to make sure you're not using non-standard bullets. So we have these here, and it looks like a bulleted list, and the stars are sort of functioning as bullets here. But in reality, these are just a character that got inserted. It's not actually defined as a list. And so this is easy to fix. Again, we just highlight all of this stuff and do the bulleted list. And you can see, because those were characters, it's including those as part of the list. So we would just want to delete those out, and we're good to go. Now, say you liked the stars as bullets. Say you wanted to keep using those. You can do that. So if you just highlight all of your items here and click on this little down arrow next to the bulleted list, you can define your own bullet styles. So if I just go into define a new bullet here, and I can change, and I click on bullet right here, I can choose what I want that bullet to look like from all of these different options here. So let's say I wanted it to be this delta symbol for whatever reason. I wanted that to be my bullet. I click OK, I click OK there, and it will change it. So you can use specific styles and formatting for your bullets if you want. You just have to go in and manually define it rather than just sort of inserting the character. And then for line spacing, a lot of times what you will see is if someone wants to include extra space between a paragraph and the next heading, a common thing that people will do is just hit enter a few times. The problem with that is when an individual is relying on a screen reader, it's going to read out each individual blank line to them. They have no way of just sort of skipping over all of these. And so it's going to read blank line, blank line, blank line, blank line over and over to them until they get to the next piece of content. So an easy way of fixing this, rather than doing blank lines, is changing the paragraph formatting. So if I highlight this here and I go to, okay, where is it? I always forget where this option is. I don't have it shared on my screen right now, but if you go to the format menu and then paragraph, it will bring this up. And you can change the line spacing both before and after the paragraph. So if I want to say have 12 points of spacing after the or 18 points of spacing after the paragraph, it will drop that in right under the paragraph and increase that spacing for me without having a bunch of extra lines that get read out to the learner. Any questions on any of that?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So I've heard you say like this is how it will show up on a screen reader. Is there ever is there anything in Word or just on our computers that would say how it shows up in a screen reader, like that we could check?
So there isn't anything that will give you sort of a specific one-to-one, and this is how it's going to be perceived on a screen reader without actually installing a screen reader like JAWS itself. But there is an accessibility checker within Microsoft Word. If you go to the review tab here,
okay,
and click on check accessibility, this won't find everything for you, but it will often give you a list of a lot of things that need to be fixed. So this is one quick way to sort of get an overview of some of the accessibility issues that might exist in your document. It's not going to find everything, but it is a good first step. But you can always use, like you can get trial versions of some software like screen readers. I will warn you that if you're not familiar with how they work, it can be very disorienting to try to use them without any experience. I know, Molly, you spent a lot of time sort of messing with JAWS and doing more with that. Do you have any tips for finding things that might be like, this is how a screen reader is going to perceive this content?
Yeah, so great question.
So I didn't mean to put you on the spot here.
No worries. That's why I'm here. So for headings, using the navigation tab, like Dave said on the left, that's a really great visual way to see what a screen reader picks up on and what it does not. If it's invisible on the list over on the left, it won't be considered a title or a heading. For spacing, I like to use, Dave, if you want to go to the home tab, and then the little paragraph, yeah, that one. That's good for finding a lot of repeat spaces. I think some versions of the Microsoft Accessibility Checker will find those as well. But that's a great, just sort of, again, visual way. If you see a bunch of those little things in a row, each and every one is going to say blank, blank, blank. And you just have to kind of like think about it and be like, oh, yeah, that would be annoying. Again, I think the accessibility checker is going to be best. Any pictures that are not in line are going to be invisible, potentially. Yeah, and then if you wanted to, you could get JAWS for free. There's a trial version where it works for 40 minutes and then makes you restart your computer before it'll work for another 40 minutes. Last I checked, so you can use that. NVDA is a totally free screen reader. It's becoming more common to use because it's free, but I've heard it's not as good or as preferred as JAWS. But if you do try to get started with that, just kind of starting at the top of your document and then just arrowing down and just listening your way through, that can be one way to. It's a fun empathy building exercise, if nothing else, because you'll get to a list and it'll say, if you get to a list that Dave had not fixed yet, it would just say 1, identify the most common, 2, use word styles, paint, and you wouldn't know how long the list is, whether it's like 1 item or 100 items. But when you get to it with a screen reader, it adds additional helpful information. It says list of 3 items. So then you know immediately, do I want to bother perusing this list, or do I just want to skip right over it? So I do think checking with a screen reader is valuable if you have the time and the patience to try it out and be willing to be frustrated. But I would not say that, in order to be accessible, everyone must download a screen reader and try to screen reader test their own documents, because that's just not true.
And the other thing the defining things as a list will do is it will define each individual list item and make that a navigable item for someone using a screen reader. So rather than sort of having to go back through the test, it can read out list item 1, list item 2, list item 3. So that's another value to that as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Good deal. So the last, and Molly just sort of alluded to this a little bit, one of the things you want to do with images in Word is making sure the text does not wrap around them, but that the images are displayed in line. And this is, again, relatively easy to do. I can find, wrap text, here we go. So you just select the picture here and you can choose how the text wraps around it. And you want to make sure that just this in line with text is showing. And there are a bunch of different options here that will change how, you can see when I select a different one, it changes how the text sort of wraps and flows around an image. If it's not in line, generally that image is going to be completely invisible to a screen reader. So this is just an easy thing to do, make sure your images are listed in line. And we'll talk a little bit more about images and alt text now. So you may have heard of alternative text or alt text as a way of adding text to images to make sure that the learner can get the informational context that they're relying on. And this is helpful because they obviously can't see the image, right? So it's up to you to describe why that image is important to them or why they should care about that image. And one of the first rules is to just be succinct about it. If a sighted user has the ability to sort of glance through a document and see all the images quickly and make a quick determination about whether or not this is something useful or something they want to pay attention to. If you're including alternative text on an image, a user relying on a screen reader doesn't have that option. They can't scan the text. They have to hear the text read aloud literally every time they encounter the image. So general rule is about 140 characters per piece of alt text, so about half the length of a tweet. This made more sense when Twitter had a character limit of 140 characters and you could just say make it the length of a tweet, but it still works. And then you want to present the same content and function of the image. It's not just about rote description of the image. It's about making sure that the learning context or the importance of the image is being portrayed. So let's do a few examples here of sort of different ways you might write alt text. Because that's one of the questions that I often get asked is, okay, so I understand that I have to do alt text, but how should I write it? And the reality is there's no perfect one way to write alt text. It's more of an art form, and there is no one single piece of alt text that will be perfect or correct for any particular image. But again, you want the image to describe the context that your learner should derive from the image. For example, I've got three identical pictures of George Washington up here on the screen with 3 different examples of alt text. And imagine that the text to the right is the alt text that we would be adding to the image. So in the first image, maybe I'm teaching an elementary course on US history, and the important thing that I want the learners to get is that George Washington was the first president of the United States of America. So that's what I put in my alt text, George Washington, first president of the United States. In the second example, maybe I'm teaching an art history course, and I care less about the fact that Washington was the first president. I care even less kind of that Washington was really in the picture. What I care more about is the artist. So Gilbert Stuart gained fame painting presidential portraits, including this one of George Washington. The alt text is more focused on the history of the piece rather than the content. And then maybe in the third option, I'm teaching a more in-depth course on sort of the founding and economic history of the US. So I'm interested in the specific historical moment of the image. So this is Washington signing the Jay Treaty, December 1795, which helped ease tensions between the US and Great Britain. So that's the important part of the image. And adding alt text to images in Word is also pretty simple. So if we go back here, all I have to do is right click on the image and click add alt text. And I can put in whatever I want here. We don't normally say to describe the image literally, but in this case I will. So man climbing a staircase of books. And the other thing you can do is, if your image is just there to be purely decorative, if it has no meaningful content or context around it at all, it's just there to look pretty, you can mark the image as decorative. And you don't have to worry about adding alt text. You can say a person relying on a screen reader doesn't really have to be concerned with what's in this image. Any questions on alt text? All right, so now we'll go to color and content, making everything readable. The first thing we're going to talk about here is color, which isn't often something that we talk about when we're thinking of accessibility, but we want to make sure we're paying attention to it. Hold on, I'm just reading the chat here. Yes, that's a good point, Molly. Alt text is primarily for images. If you can't describe something, and this comes up a lot in graphs and charts, put that information in the text. And you don't need to, if you're repeating the information in the text that is in your alt text, you don't really need to include that alt text. It needs to be sort of in one place or the other. If you're describing the image in the body text, I would mark the image as decorative and then not include the alt text, because otherwise the learner is going to hear that repeated to them multiple times. So with color, obviously I've got a couple examples here on the screen. You want to make sure you have high contrast between your foreground and background colors. So individuals who maybe have challenges distinguishing that context can make it easier to read. Obviously, the good example here, I have nice dark text on a white background. The bad example is I have yellow text on a white background, which makes your eyes bleed. There is kind of a magic number of a contrast ratio that you want to hit for accessibility purposes. It's not really something that Word can measure for you. If we were in Canvas, Canvas has a neat accessibility checker that will actually tell you the contrast ratio that you're looking for. But I wouldn't worry too much about specific numbers. But Word will call it out if it is not contrasty enough. And then there's also color blindness, which is actually, I learned recently, is way more common in men than women. Something like 1 in 7 men have some form of color blindness. And this image here on the right shows various different types of color blindness. And so just a few things to keep in mind when you're designing and building documents for color blindness is, don't use color as the only identifier of a thing. If you've got 2 identical buttons or 2 identical pieces of text, it's going to pose a big challenge if those 2 things are exactly the same. Do something else to differentiate them as well, like making a different shape or adding differentiating text to a button, like if you have yes and no, one's green, one's a different color, that's fine. And you want to make sure that you don't refer to things only by their color as well. Like you wouldn't want to say, read the green text above this paragraph, because a person who is colorblind might not be able to tell what text you're talking about. And then just general content design rules. Use simple fonts. Generally speaking, particularly if you're doing digital documents, sans serif fonts, so fonts without the little dangly bits on the end, are more appropriate and easier to read. Avoid underlining. Specifically, excessive underlining can get to be a problem. Use things that are simple and consistent. So keep the same sort of design language throughout your entire document. Don't use 5 different fonts. And then write in simple, plain language. And you can do in Word, there's a way that you can measure the reading ease of your document. If you go to the word count here, it will, nope, it won't. Where's it at? It's in spell. I will find this later because I have forgotten where this feature is, but it will tell you how the reading ease of your document. There's a couple different scales that you can measure the reading of your document. It's the Flesch-Kincaid reading scale. And then there's one other one. And basically it will tell you the grade level that your document is written for. And there are specific scores that you want to aim for. So just sort of keeping things as simple and as clean as possible. Obviously, you don't want your document to look like this image over here on the right. And then tables. So there are a couple different schools of thought when it comes to tables in design. A lot of people will tell you just don't use tables at all. And that is certainly a very simple and easy to follow rule of getting rid of all your tables. However, there are ways that you can make tables more accessible and also still use them. And I kind of tend to lean towards that camp a little bit, because getting people to give up their tables can often be a pain. And sometimes there is just data or information that is best described and shared within a table. So what I hope to do is give you some strategies and tools that you can use to make your tables more accessible and more parsable. And the first thing you need to know is how a screen reader is going to interact and how it's going to read a table. It's always going to go left to right and then top to bottom. So a screen reader relying on a table is going to read things heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, 1, 33, 1, 3, 1, 87. And it's always going to read things in that order. Unlike a sighted user who sort of has the ability to jump around a table and scan things quickly, again, it's kind of the same thing as an image. A person relying on a screen reader doesn't have the ability to sort of jump back and zoom out and see the entire context of the table at once. They're always experiencing it one cell at a time. So the first thing you want to do is include a caption on your table. And I've got one here for this one, a table of random data used as an example. And this is just to give the learner the context of, hey, there's a table coming up. This is what's in this table. You can decide whether or not you want to engage with or whether or not you want to skip the table. I've seen a lot of times in the past where people will put a heading or a caption for a table underneath the table, which is not nearly as good, right? Because then the learner's gone through the entire table before they even understand what the data is or what it is that they should be looking for, what context they should be putting the data in. And then heading rows and columns. You want to make sure, so you can see here in this example, I've got clearly defined heading rows. It says heading 1, heading 2, heading 3. It's a different color. It very clearly signifies that these are heading rows, and these are also defined sort of in the code of the table itself as a heading. And so when a learner navigates to any cell in the table, the screen reader will read out what column they're in. So you can, or what row they're in. You can also define heading rows. So if they were to navigate to this cell here, it would be heading to, or column 2, 5. And so it would give them a way of orienting themselves in the table rather than it otherwise being very easy for them to lose track of where they are. So this is pretty easy to set up as well in Word. Let me turn off these here. If we go to our table and we right click and we go to table properties here, and we click on alt text over here on the right, this is where we can add a title or a caption to our table. So we'll change this and we'll make this title Final Grade Determination. And we've got something that kind of looks like a heading row up here. It's got a different color text and it's got a different color background, but we also need to define this as a heading row within the table. So all we have to do is right click the table and table properties, and we can repeat the header row across pages. And that way, if this column spreads across pages as well, so if this table were to go onto the next page, it would repeat this header row as well, again, to make it easier for a learner to realize this. And then to define it as a header row, we just go here and we go to the table design tab and click header row. And now this is defined in the code as a heading row for the table, so it will read it out every time. Any questions on any of that? All right, and then the last thing is links, creating readable hyperlinks in your table. And this is just sort of readable hyperlinks in your document. And this is just sort of a few strategies that you can use to make sure you create good links. Links can be read aloud by a screen reader by themselves. So a learner relying on a screen reader can just say, hey, read me all of the links in this document if they're just quickly scanning to see maybe what connections or where else they might want to go. And so it's important to make sure that those links can be understood on their own without needing the surrounding context of the document. So there's a few rules we want to follow. For example, you don't want to have links that say, click here, because if the individual is just going through the list of links and they just encounter 10 links that say, click here, they're not going to have any idea which link is which, where those links are taking them, or why they may or may not want to click on them. And you want to avoid full URLs when you're creating links, because again, that's something that's going to be read aloud by the screen reader. And so it's going to, if they were to encounter this link here, be visit http://www.youtube.com, and it would read out the whole thing. And that might not sound bad for something like YouTube, but if you're getting into a long link that's linking 5 layers down into a web page, that can get pretty long and pretty confusing pretty quickly. You want to avoid long descriptive links. Give context and make it understandable, but keep it simple, because again, the whole link is going to be read aloud every time. Visit YouTube, a site where you create and host videos. Most people are familiar with what YouTube is. So this extra information in the link isn't necessary. So finally, you've got a link that's short. It tells the individual where it's going. It gives context for what it is. Just visit YouTube. So short, simple, and descriptive is what you're going for there. So those are sort of the basic principles of document accessibility, and it can really seem like a lot, right? If you try to apply all of these things to all of your documents all at once, it can very easily feel overwhelming. Like there's just too much to do. How am I ever, particularly if you've got a large library of documents that you want to go and try to remediate and make more accessible. My suggestion would be in that case to just don't try to do everything once. Pick one of these areas that you want to focus on and maybe say, I'm going to go through all of my documents and make sure they have correct heading styles. Or I'm going to go through and make sure all of my links are properly described. And just work on doing one thing at a time for a small section of your documents and make incremental progress that way. Even if you make some of your documents just a little bit more accessible in specific ways, you might have made that document 100% more accessible for an individual person, right? So any small sort of baby steps that we can take is better than nothing. So don't get paralyzed by having, oh my gosh, there's just way too much to do, I can never do any of it. Small steps are better than no steps. And then just a few things as we wrap up here. A lot of these things that we talked about apply to PowerPoint presentations as well, but there's just a couple more principles here that you can apply. Rather than always designing your own templates, use the ones that Microsoft have made. I know we do a lot of PowerPoints and people see a lot of PowerPoints, and if you use the standard Microsoft templates, it can get kind of old seeing the same stuff over and over again. But these templates are designed to be accessible, so using one that's provided by Microsoft can be an easy way to make sure that a lot of the stuff in there is accessible. Simple or plain white backgrounds. Again, don't do anything too complex that's going to make your layout very challenging to see. Give all your slides descriptive titles. This is one where I personally really need to work. I am really bad at this. I tend to usually just throw images up on a slide and talk about them. So I need to get better at that. Make your font size large enough so that people can read it. Use simple animations. There's a ton of sort of fly in and fly out and gradient animations in PowerPoint. Like all those can really be super complicated and confusing for someone who, particularly maybe if they are a neurodiverse individual, it can make things very difficult to follow. Again, simple and clear language. And then use the built-in accessibility checker. The accessibility checker that I showed you over in the Word document also has a counterpoint in PowerPoint that will do things like make sure the items in your slide are being read in the correct order that you anticipate them being read in. And so it will say, this is the first thing that's going to be read on a slide. This is the second thing. This is the third thing. So that can be really helpful to go through as well. We've got just a few resources here. If you're interested in following up or learning more about any of this stuff, here's some things that you can do. And I'll send out this PowerPoint later so you have all that information. But that is pretty much it. Are there any questions that we didn't cover as we were going?
One question I just thought of. I signed up for this training because there's a possibility I'll be linking documents online for our website. So if I were to use Word and then transfer it to a PDF, do a lot of these principles still hold true?
That is a great question. So, and there will, depending on who you ask, you will get different answers to this question. There is a way to save a Word document as a PDF where it will maintain a lot of the accessibility features. It's not a guarantee that it will get everything. Generally speaking, from an accessibility standpoint, we recommend keeping things in sort of that native document format as much as possible. Because, and what that does is it allows the user to make adjustments to the document if they need to, right? So a PDF keeps it very static, and this is the one way you're going to view the document. But if say somebody needs to increase the font size of a particular area of a Word document, if they download the Word document, they can make those adjustments to make it more usable for themselves. But let me show you, let me reshare here and I will show you how to save things for the web for PDF. So if I go to the file menu and save as, I can save it as a PDF down here, and it will ask me if I want to do it for electronic distribution and accessibility or best for printing. When you're saving as a PDF, just make sure you select this best for electronic distribution, and that will save as many of the accessibility features as Word is capable of saving.